Hey everyone, Tim here from Snap Attack. Let's dig into this week's Threat Snapshot. So today we're going to be talking about drivers, and specifically vulnerable drivers. These belong to a class of attack known as BYOVD, or Bring Your Own Vulnerable Driver. And we've seen an uptick of this activity by threat actors, so we think it's important to talk through. So let's talk about what a driver is at a high level and why would somebody want to bring their own vulnerable driver. So drivers on Windows are going to allow you to operate with the kernel and interact with that at a lower level. Think about how your keyboard or mouse or video card are going to interact. So these drivers allow them to communicate with the operating system at that low level. Oftentimes these vulnerable drivers can be abused to gain remote code execution, to kill processes, to really get at that higher level privilege that you're not going to have ordinarily on a system. So by bringing your own vulnerable driver, a threat actor can exploit that vulnerability to gain additional access. Another way that we've seen this commonly used is to bypass EDRs or unhook them, or to really limit the amount of visibility that you're going to have, as there is less kernel level logging on an operating system. So this is often why we're seeing attackers use it, but there are some other aspects to vulnerable drivers as well that make it particularly appealing. One is that antivirus and EDRs don't often block these. Again, they have a very much legitimate use case. If you can imagine having a vulnerable driver on your system, but maybe there isn't an updated one in place or it's not installed, if they started removing those files, that's going to, block those devices from working on your system. So, that could be very dangerous. So that's why they don't often have a very preventative, method of defense. Another thing is that these are, again, legitimately signed drivers, even if the certificate is later revoked or the driver is blacklisted. Because of backwards compatibility and legacy reasons, Microsoft operating systems will mostly more than happily accept and install that driver and use it. So it makes it very easy for attackers to bring along. So what about this activity is interesting, and why are we talking about this today? So there is a financially motivated threat actor that has been using this recently, tracked by a couple of different organizations and teams. So we'll talk here first about Mandiant. This was a blog post they put out middle of December of last year. So they were seeing this threat actor using their own drivers to bypass endpoint and detection response tools. As I mentioned, that's again going to give them ability to do their operations without a lot of visibility, which makes investigating and finding that behavior hard. So can definitely give through a read. They give a very good lower level description of this. So Mandiant tracks this threat actor as UNC3944. Just a little bit about the threat actor and the UNC groups. So these are uncategorized. Again, they're not going to be a fully named threat actor like an APT or a FIN, financially motivated yet. Again, this is still early on raw threat intelligence that they're seeing. So since this group is a little bit on the newer side, they don't have as strong of attribution. This is tracked by different organizations as well. So CrowdStrike, we can see here, this is also known as Scattered Spider. Microsoft has some of their own internal names for this actor. As I mentioned, they are financially motivated. They are targeting a lot of times US companies and against a lot of industries, so financial services, technology, telecommunications. Related here was this Scattered Spider bring your own vulnerable driver attack that CrowdStrike reported. So these are different attack vectors, or really different hashes, different binaries, but they were still using that same technique. In particular here, CrowdStrike saw them using a vulnerable Intel driver that's quite a bit old. I want to say the vulnerability against that was from 2015, maybe even older. So they have a couple of samples here that they saw, two of these hashes here. VirusTotal, none of the others have this, so we can't actually replicate this binary exactly, but we do know that vulnerable Windows driver, specifically the Intel one, that we can emulate, and we can see how that would look in a real environment. So that's one of the things we'll look at in the snapshot, as well as some other vulnerable drivers. Do want to say that this is not a brand new technique by any means. I think Lazarus Group had used this initially. They had a Dell driver that they used. BlackByte, they used the MSI Afterburner. Rapid7, this is a little older blog post from 2021, but still really good. highlighting this attack, usage in the wild, who's used it, what drivers. So this is something that you definitely would want to have detections in your arsenal. And again, with EDRs, having more visibility and being more prevalent, I can see this sort of attack class being more prevalent in the next year, especially because attackers want to remain undetected as long as possible, and this allows them to evade EDRs. So another quick shout out for threat intelligence here. This is for Mike Hague. So at the SANS DFIR Summit, he did a really good talk on hunting Windows U-boats with cyber depth charges. This is around the bring your own vulnerable driver attack vector, drivers, and lower level rootkits. So definitely worth a watch. It's 30 minutes, very approachable, has some good threat hunting and detection prevention strategies in there. And related to this, you all know the living off the land, the scripts and binaries, the LOL BAS project. So he has his own LOL drivers project, related to this that he is going to be releasing. So keep an eye out for that. Again, this is a compiled list of all the different drivers and different exploits around there that can be used. So very interesting. The other thing I'll just say, he had some unique commentary that I hadn't seen before on the scattered spider threat that CrowdStrike had mentioned. Two of these are good for hunting. One in particular, the date of the binary. So this was, set to 1970. I don't think there are going to be very often binaries from 1970 working in a modern Windows environment. So that would stick out like a sore thumb. Again, good for hunting. Another one here that he pointed out was the Windows Development Kit test cert. So yes, when you're developing a driver for your own, you can sign it yourself with a test cert and use that to install on systems, and that is another way to get a signed driver. So again, things like that we'll definitely see a lot more in the coming year, and we'll see this threat a lot. Let's pivot over to Snap Attack. Let's talk about this in a little bit more depth. So as I mentioned, we don't actually have the POCs that CrowdStrike had talked about, but we're going to take a look at that Intel vulnerable driver here. So this is the KDU project, the kernel driver utility that has a lot of these vulnerable drivers and exploits. This is several years old. They keep adding and maintaining. So it is that Intel driver here that we're going to look at. That's provider 0. But as you can see, there are lots of drivers, lots of vulnerabilities you can exploit. They have 30 right now and probably more that will be coming over time. So we can take a look at that in Snap Attack. As again, okay, cool, mentioned that it's a CVE 2015-2291 that exploits this driver. We'll take a quick look at the video for that. This is not going to be a super sophisticated attack by any means. We're just going to run KDU here and we are going to pop calc. But imagine you could do other sort of attacks. Again, if you wanted to run Mimikatz or install something else at a higher privilege level, we could certainly go through and do that. So we can see, again, the attack. We have detections here. We'll talk about some of those in a minute. Just wanted to highlight another BYOVD attack, and we definitely have more of these in the platform too, so subscribers check them out. I mentioned before there was that Dell vulnerable driver that Lazarus Group had previously used. There is again, really cool library. It's called Delicious, love the pun. And this is able to disable the LSA protections. So this is a really cool kind of side-by-side on why this is important. So we've got Mimikatz up here. We do have the LSA protections, and we can't actually dump the credentials from memory with Mimikatz because that is, the LSAS binary is protected. However, we can use, this vulnerable Dell driver here. And we'll just skip ahead a little bit in the video. So we're going to do that Delicious on LSAS with the PID, and we are able to use that to, again, bypass that at that lower level and finally get those credentials here. So again, this is where that becomes, again, very valuable to an attacker getting that, higher level, kernel level privilege, and it's definitely something that I think we'll be seeing more of these attacks here. So all right, how do I hunt for this? How should I stay protected? Pivoting over, let's talk through some detections. So this is one that I think is kind of funny, but it's very effective for this sort of thing. There is a list of known drivers. These are, again, signed binaries. So again, an attacker is not going to want to change that because the signature would not be valid anymore. So IOCs, your domains, IPs, hashes, and specifically file hashes are a good way to do this. So this Sigma community rule goes through all the SHA-1, SHA-256, and I think MD5 hashes too, probably, of these binaries. So we can take a look at this. This definitely works. It is a long list of hashes that are bad. There are other projects that track this too. So as long as you're keeping up to date with those hashes, this is an effective way to look at it. I'm going to actually, pivot and take a look at the image loaded so we can see some of these vulnerable drivers. So that Capcom SIS, or that was an anti-cheat driver. We can see some of the ones that we were looking at here. That now DRV SIS, that's the Intel one. We can see other driver utilities here. So this is very much a high confidence, low false positive way to see is this driver in my environment. Again, not necessarily indicative of exploitation, but at least you know that this is installed and present. Hunting for this too, there's a couple ways that we can do this. So two in particular Windows event logs that we can use. This one is 7045, so we're looking for new service installations, and specifically there's a service type for kernel mode drivers that we can scope this to. So we could use this for threat hunting. Again, there's going to be a lot of false positives because this is going to include all driver installations. But we could see here some examples. So, we're seeing Mimikatz drivers loaded. This would also work for, these bring your own vulnerable driver attacks as well. There is a sister event to this as well that we can look at. So Windows Security 4697 is also looking for service installations, and specifically, again, they have a different type. It's hex 01, which is going to be the kernel driver. So we can see, again, Mimikatz driver installations, other BYOVD attacks. Similar quality, again, you could use this for hunting. There are going to be false positives in a real world environment, but definitely a way that you can, look for these, especially if you are not familiar with hashes, or there are, new ones that are unknown to be vulnerable at the time, and you want to catch those earlier on. One other interesting detection, again, that Mike Hague talked about in his talk was looking for drivers loaded from suspicious locations. This in particular is useful because, again, drivers can be loaded from anywhere on Windows. If an attacker, is running out of a downloads folder, or they're running out of a temp directory, more than likely a legitimate driver is not going to be there. So this is certainly a pretty effective detection. Again, it's going to take some tuning here. So we're looking for all drivers that are not coming from, again, the System32 drivers folder or driver store. Print spool drivers you've seen. Program data often has a lot of drivers where they get installed, and some other ones that we have. So we can already see here some of the hits that this has, the bring your own vulnerable driver. If I pivot over to Splunk here and I want to take a look at the image loaded, so again, as I mentioned, there are going to be false positives here. You can see that there is a Splunk driver that's being loaded out of their program files folder. So in your environment, you'll have to, do some tuning for this, but we're able to, suck up and pick, Mimikatz detections, again, some of these other BYOVD attacks, or that Capcom, the Intel driver, very effective here as well. So, if we had a detection like this that we felt, really comfortable, again, SnapAttack makes that easy to, one-click deploy to a configured integration. So I'm going to deploy this to CrowdStrike as a, IOA, one of their EDR rules, and I can get that immediate, protection against this sort of attack and alert me whenever this sort of behavior is going on in my environment. So we make it easy for you to stay ahead of the threat. That's our snapshot for this week. It's a weekly series. Like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time.